Today we're back on the battlefields of Loos, and we're here to take a look at 5 fascinating stories from right here in these battlefields around us. So today we're starting off our video in Quarry Cemetery, just on the outskirts of Loos. For today's video, we're going to be taking a look at 5 fascinating stories you can learn about if you come here to explore this area of the 1915 battlefields. And we're starting off here in Quarry Cemetery because there is a grave here for a man by the name of Captain the Honourable Fergus Bowes-Lyon. And we're going to start off by telling his story just here. So here in Quarry Cemetery, we have the headstone of Captain the Honourable Fergus Bowes-Lyon of the Black Watch, killed on the 27th of September 1915 when he was 26 years old. Now you notice at the top of this headstone it says buried near this spot. Well, that's because Captain Fergus Bowes-Lyon is actually named on the Loos Memorial to the Missing. He was believed to be missing for several years, until it was identified that actually he had been buried here at Quarry Cemetery. Now his original headstone was lost, so it's not known exactly where he is buried in here, but it's known he's buried somewhere here, which is why he has the headstone with the top message, buried near this spot. Now, Fergus Bowes-Lyon's story is fascinating in itself, but it's also interesting because he is the great uncle of King Charles, of course, the uncle of the late Queen Elizabeth and the brother of the late Queen Mother. Now, it's also part of what makes his story interesting is the fact that, of course, whilst he has a known headstone here, he didn't originally, as was mentioned earlier. Now, he was killed in fighting here in the attack on the Hohenzollern Redoubt, just across from Quarry Cemetery. He was badly wounded on the battlefield, and then as he lay wounded, he was injured and shot again by German fire. He died here on the battlefield and was buried soon after here at Quarry Cemetery. Then his headstone was lost. Several of the headstones in this area were lost due to this being right near the front lines, and these graves came under heavy artillery fire. Sadly, that meant the headstone was lost, but later in 2011 records became apparent that told us he was buried right here at Quarry Cemetery. So in 2011, Fergus Bowes-Lyon's grandson shared some detailed family records, and in that included details of his burial and confirmed that he had been buried here at Quarry Cemetery, and obviously his headstone subsequently lost. In August 2012, this headstone was placed here, named with the message as we described, buried near this spot. And although Captain the Honourable Fergus Bowes-Lyon is still named on the Loos Memorial, he now has a headstone here at Quarry Cemetery. King Charles' great uncle, Captain the Honourable Fergus Bowes-Lyon with the Black Watch, killed in the attack on the Hohenzollern Redoubt here on the 27th of September 1915. He was just 26 years old. So I hope you agree it's a really interesting story here at the Quarry Cemetery. From here we're going to head just up the road to another cemetery to tell the second of our 5 fascinating stories from here on the Loos battlefields. So for our second fascinating story from the Battle of Loos, we've just moved up the road to the St Mary's ADS Cemetery. And this is actually a man whose story we've told before on the channel. We've actually made a whole video about him. And I really recommend checking that one out because that includes all the real full story and the locations, and we go visit the spots where he fought. But we're here at St Mary's ADS to visit the grave of Lieutenant John Kipling. A real fascinating story from here on the Loos battlefields. Let's take a look. So here we have the grave of Lieutenant John Kipling of the Irish Guards, killed on the 27th of September 1915. Now, John's story is interesting. He is actually named on the Loos Memorial to the Missing, and that's because he was missing for many years. Now, his story is one of tragedy for the family, as it was for so many families of men who were missing on battlefields of the Great War. John Kipling is the son of the famous author Rudyard Kipling. Rudyard Kipling was actively involved in the War Office and kind of messaging to do with the war. And he actively encouraged his son John to get involved in the war and join up. Now, after the war, he felt tremendous guilt about that, and he invested a huge amount of money to try to identify the whereabouts of John Kipling. That included interviewing fellow soldiers who he'd been with, and in fact, he volunteered to write the official history of the Irish Guards so that he would have access to all the papers and war diaries and everything to help him identify where John's body might be. Sadly, he never managed to find where he was, and it was actually after Rudyard Kipling's death that the grave of John Kipling was identified by an independent researcher who put together a few different bits, and it includes some map references that were noted to be incorrect. And so a headstone here that originally was for an unknown lieutenant of the Irish Guards was renamed to that headstone of John Kipling, Lieutenant of the Irish Guards. Now, John Kipling's story is covered in a fascinating movie called My Boy Jack. If anyone hasn't seen the movie My Boy Jack, I really recommend it. It tells the heartbreaking story of Rudyard Kipling and his wife Kerry's search to try to find what had happened to John after he went missing here on the battlefields at Loos. A really great movie, which I recommend. Later on, the poem My Boy Jack, that the movie is named after, was written by Rudyard Kipling, and it's believed that poem is the heartache story of him sharing over the guilt that he felt over his son's death here in the Great War. Fascinating story here from Loos that I hope you have enjoyed. So from here, we're heading just up the road to Dud Corner Cemetery. So the first two men who we've told the stories for in this video are men who are named here on the Loos Memorial, but now do have known graves. The next man that we've come to talk about is somebody who's named here on the Loos Memorial as well, but at this stage doesn't have a known grave. Potentially will have no known grave forevermore. The man we've come to talk about is actually the first man named on the panel here at the top of panel 1, and that's because he is the most senior officer named here on the Loos Memorial, Major General George Handcock Thesiger. So up here behind me on panel 1, we have the name of Major General Thesiger. Now, often when you hear the stories of generals, especially senior generals, you will hear the old story of generals die in bed, they're never out on the battlefield, they sit in chateaus behind the line and direct their men to their deaths. Well, this is a general who very much goes against that theory. This is a man who was out in the front lines when he was killed. A couple of days into the Battle of Loos, he got word the men of his division were in an awful situation. He got news that the men of the 73rd Brigade were on the verge of breaking due to the heavy fire that they were under. He immediately gathered his divisional staff and went out to the front lines to assess the situation for himself. So here at Dud Corner Cemetery, on the Loos Memorial, at the top of the first panel, we have the name, under Commands and Staff, Major General G.H. Thesiger. That's Major General George Handcock Thesiger. And he was here in this area a couple of days into the Battle of Loos, and he went out to the front line to assess the situation and understand the challenges that his division were facing. So Thesiger gathered his men and went out to those front lines positions, and he was actually in an area of trenches opposite the Hohenzollern Redoubt, an area that we've talked about before on the channel. Whilst he was there, the German artillery opened fire on the British positions, and one of the shells exploded directly in the trench where they were. Instantly, that killed Major General Thesiger and his aide, Major Limoti and Lieutenant Burney. None of their bodies were able to be removed from the battlefield as fighting continued that day and subsequent days afterwards. Later, Burney's remains were recovered, but sadly, Major General Thesiger was never recovered. He has no known grave, quite likely still lays out there on the battlefields today, and he's among the 20,000 names recorded here on the Loos Memorial to the missing. So that old story, generals die in bed, they don't get involved in the front line, they don't go out into anywhere dangerous. Well, Major General Thesiger put that myth to bed. He was killed out in the front lines, trying to understand what his men were dealing with, trying to get involved with them and see if he could make a difference. named here on the Loos Memorial to the Missing among so many thousands of other men. So from here, we're going to go just a little bit up the road to the town of Bethune to go and tell another couple fascinating stories. So for our last couple of stories, we've just come up to the Bethune Town Cemetery. Now this is a civilian cemetery in the centre of Bethune that also has a military cemetery. That was fairly common in parts of the war. Then initially, as men started to be killed and they needed burial places, they were buried in existing civilian cemeteries. In some cases they were expanded. That's the case here. There's a small plot where we are just now for our first story, and there's a much larger plot over a little bit further up where we're going to go for our final story of the video. But initially we're here to tell the story of Captain Kanwar Indarjit Singh. He was an Indian medical officer who was serving just here near Bethune when he was killed. Let's go and tell his story now. So just here in Bethune Town Cemetery, we have this small plot on the right. The larger plot is just up ahead of us here. And over here, I'm slightly different here because when you look at this front row, we have almost all senior officers. So captains, lieutenants, there's a lot of majors down here, lieutenant colonels. It's interesting to see because, of course, in your typical Commonwealth grave cemetery, these officers would just be intermingled with a load of other men, but they all sit here in this front row. Now this whole plot isn't like that because I can see privates back there, and in fact I can see some unknown soldiers further back as well, but this front row does seem to be exclusively senior officers. So in the early part of the war there were sometimes situations where officers were buried separately like this, and amongst these majors, lieutenants, lieutenant colonels, captains, majors, we have Captain K.I. Singh MC. Now, before we actually get on to Captain Singh's story, he is laying next to a recipient of the Victoria Cross, Lieutenant Frank A. de Pass VC. So kind of a bonus sixth story here for you, because I actually wasn't going to include Lieutenant de Pass's story into it, but seeing as he lays next to Singh, I figured I might as well. So killed actually the day after Captain Singh, 25th of November 1914. He was involved in heavy fighting near Festubert, and he was awarded the Victoria Cross for actions in moving forward gallantry to try to capture a German sap. There were also actions where he rescued a wounded man, and in his second attempt following that to try to capture that same German trench, he was killed, and he was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross. Lieutenant Frank A. de Pass VC, 34th Pune Horse. He was a British Indian Army officer. Okay, so on to the story of Captain Kanwar Singh MC. He was an Indian medical service officer. He was born in India in 1883. He was one of 11 children, and he attended school in Punjab in India. He then went to Pembroke College in Cambridge and King's College London, where he obtained his BA and medical qualifications. He was commissioned in the Indian Medical Service in 1911. Now in 1914 he was serving just near here in Bethune, just behind the front lines, about 1,500 yards from the front line, when that area came under artillery fire from the Germans. Now in normal cases people like medical officers might be removed and brought slightly back behind the line in that type of circumstance, but Captain Singh refused to do that. He wanted to stay right behind the front line, helping the wounded men that he was already treating. He refused to move back, and the house that he was working in at the time took a direct hit from a shell, and he was killed. Now it's interesting that Captain Singh lays next to a Victoria Cross recipient, because he was awarded a military cross for his bravery in that particular incident. But when you consider the story of what he did and the bravery that showed, there's a lot of people who argued that he potentially should have been the recipient of a Victoria Cross. He would have been the first Indian to receive the Victoria Cross, but unfortunately for whatever reason he didn't. He was awarded the military cross for his bravery in that action, and now he rests here at Bethune Town Cemetery. Okay, so for our next and final story, we're going to head just further up the path here to the main section of the military cemetery here in the Bethune town cemetery. Now for our last story here from the Loos battlefields, we've come over to the larger section of graves here at Bethune Town Cemetery. And we're actually here to tell a fairly tragic story, but nonetheless a fascinating story. Let's take a look. So again, just within the civilian cemetery, we're here in the section of military cemetery here, and we're actually here to take a look at these two headstones that rest side by side. We've got Private R. Morgan of the Welsh Regiment, who died on the 15th of February 1915, and then we have Private W. Price, also of the Welsh Regiment, and you'll note he died on the same day, on the 15th of February. Well, these two men were killed on the same day, side by side, because they were both shot at dawn. Now, quite often you hear those stories of soldiers shot at dawn, you know, sad stories, tragic stories of things like being shot for cowardice or you know, running away in the face of the enemy in what realistically we now know to be a form of post-traumatic stress. But a slightly different story for these two men here, because actually these two men were guilty of murder. So a few weeks before they were shot on the 20th of January 1915, the Welsh regiment that these men served with were out digging trenches just on the outskirts of Bethune. It seemed as though some kind of incident developed, and ultimately these two men had got drunk. They were probably, as a result of that, sort of acting ill-disciplined, and their company sergeant major Hayes obviously had to intervene and have some kind of conversation with them. Now, whilst we don't know all the details of that incident, ultimately it ended with Morgan and Price shooting their company sergeant major. He sadly died the next day of the wounds that he received, and Privates Morgan and Price, probably quite rightly, were charged with murder. They were executed on the 15th of February 1915, and that's why they're buried here at Bethune Town Cemetery. Now, interestingly, in a slight, I don't know if it's a twist of fate, or I suppose because they were all serving in this area and burials were what they were, but then they had to be efficient and they had to be done locally. Company Sergeant Major Hayes actually lies in this same cemetery. Let's go take a look at his grave now. So just about 30 metres away from where those two men are buried, here we have the headstone of Company Sergeant Major H.J. Hayes. That's Hughie Hayes of the Welsh Regiment. He died on the 21st of January 1915, so the day after he was shot by those two men. When you look at his headstone here, it appears especially tragic. This was a man who had absolutely done his service. He enlisted at the age of 14 and he'd seen 18 years service. He saw action in the Boer War and then was serving in this area here on the Great War. Not killed by the enemy, not killed by shellfire, not killed by, you know, a random explosion of shrapnel. He was killed by his own men. And here he lies at Bethune Town Cemetery. At the bottom, we have words written by his mother. Oh, for the touch of the vanished hands and the voices that are still. Mother. Company Sergeant Major Hughie Hayes of the Welsh Regiment died here during the Great War, on the 21st of January 1915. So yeah, an especially tragic tale to finish off these 5 fascinating stories, but I hope you agree it was an interesting one. And I'm glad I was able to come and visit the graves of all 3 of these men to learn the story, but especially Company Sergeant Major Hayes, who died in that tragic way. I hope you guys found this video interesting, just taking a look at 5 stories that I found interesting over my time learning about the Battle of Loos. If you did enjoy it, do me a favour, do the YouTube stuff right here on the screen. Helps me out loads and loads, and I really do appreciate it. If you'd like to support the channel, you can do that via the link to my Patreon page in the description below. And in the meantime, from here at Bethune Town Cemetery on the Loos battlefields, thank you very much for watching. I'll see you on the next video.